Diagon Alley had a different quality to it after the shops closed. It wasn't quite silence. It was never quite silence. Not in a place that had been breathing magic for centuries. But it was something close to it. The kind of hush that settles over a familiar room when the last person has left and the fire is burning low. Cobblestones that had spent the whole day underfoot now caught the last of the evening light and held it, amber and unhurried. The way old stones always seem to hold warmth longer than they have any right to. The lanterns along the alley had begun their slow brightening, the way they always did when the sky softened from blue to that particular shade of bruised violet that comes just before proper dark. They didn't pop on all at once, they never did, but came alive one by one, as though each lantern was waking gently from an afternoon nap and taking a moment to remember where it was. Madame Malkin's was dark. Ollivander's was dark. Gringotts loomed at the far end of the alley, with all its usual indifference to the hour, torches blazing in their brackets as they always were, because goblins did not observe the same relationship with evening that everyone else did. Most of the other establishments had drawn their curtains and turned their signs. A hand-painted "Closed" swung gently outside Flourish and Blots, nudged by a breeze that came and went, carrying with it the faint smell of ink and old parchment that seemed to follow that particular bookshop into the street. The ice cream parlor, Florian Fortescue's, which had been shuttered once before and had only recently and rather cautiously reopened, had its awning half-rolled, the last of the day's strawberry sweetness fading from the air around it. It was into this quiet that 4 figures turned from the mouth of a side passage, carrying between them what appeared to be variously 2 large crates, a rolled length of canvas, a bag that clinked ominously with every third step, and 1 small notebook, clutched to a chest with the specific energy of someone who has been taking notes all day and intends to continue doing so. Fred Weasley was in the lead, as Fred Weasley generally was when there was something to be led toward. He was walking with the particular stride of someone who has had an idea and is now executing it before anyone sensible can object. Taller than he sometimes appeared indoors, out here in the open evening air, his hair, that particular shade of Weasley ginger that caught light readily and held it, was catching the lantern light and doing something almost festive. Behind him, George Weasley carried his end of the larger crate with the easy competence of someone who had been Fred's other half since before either of them could properly articulate what that meant. He was saying something over his shoulder, something low and amused, though who precisely he was addressing was not immediately clear, because he wasn't looking at anyone in particular. This was a habit of George's, speaking to the air, trusting that the right person would catch it. The right person, in this case, was Ron, who was behind him, and who had caught approximately none of it, because he was looking at everything except the person talking to him. He was doing the thing he often did in Diagon Alley, looking at all of it with an expression caught somewhere between familiarity and wonder, the particular expression of someone who has grown up hearing about a place rather than in it, and who still, even now, found it quietly remarkable that all of this existed, that it was real, that the lanterns were lighting themselves, and the cobblestones were old, and the air smelled of magic in that way that Diagon Alley always did, which was to say it smelled of nothing in particular and somehow everything all at once. He was carrying the crate, his side of it. He had been carrying his side of it for several minutes and had not once complained, which, for Ron Weasley, on a summer evening, when there were several perfectly reasonable things to complain about, represented a significant personal achievement. Hermione was last. She had the notebook. She also had the expression, the one that appeared on her face whenever she found herself involved in something she hadn't fully signed up for. something that had been presented to her as a quick errand. Hermione, honestly, it won't take long. And which she now wore with the resigned dignity of someone who has learned that quick errands, where the Weasley twins were involved, were neither quick nor, strictly speaking, errand-shaped. She was reading her own notes as she walked, which was impressive considering the light and the cobblestones, and the fact that Fred had just stopped very suddenly ahead of her without warning, causing her to nearly walk directly into Ron's back. "Here," Fred said. He said it the way people say things when they've been picturing a moment for a long time and are now, finally, standing in it. They all stopped. The shop was between a small apothecary that smelled of sulfur even with its windows closed and a narrow establishment that sold magical maintenance supplies and attracted almost no foot traffic whatsoever. It was not, at first glance, an especially remarkable building. The frontage was fairly wide, wider than the apothecary at least, and the windows were large, which would matter later. The door was solid and dark painted and had been rehung recently enough that it still opened smoothly on its hinges, which Fred demonstrated now. A tap of his wand, his shoulder against the wood. The door swung inward. The inside smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, and something else, something harder to name. Possibility, perhaps, which is a smell that only certain places ever quite manage. The shelves were partially built. The counter was in place but unfinished at one end. There were boxes everywhere, some open and showing their contents, others sealed with spells that hummed faintly to themselves. The floor was clean, which was more than it had been 3 days ago, and someone, George most likely, had charmed the ceiling lights to give the space a warm, even glow rather than the harsh whiteness that new spaces often suffered from. It looked, Hermione thought, looking around it with something she hadn't expected to feel, rather like the beginning of something. "Right," said George, setting down his end of the crate and rolling his shoulders. "Shall we?" "We shall," said Fred, who had already crossed to the back of the shop and was pulling the canvas roll out of Ron's arms without asking. "What is that?" Ron asked, letting him take it. "The sign," Fred said, as though this were obvious. "We knew about a sign," Hermione said. "We didn't know about—" She gestured at the canvas roll, which was about 5 feet long and was, she could now see, very faintly glowing at both ends. That, said George, is the sign. Improved. Improved how, exactly? Hermione. George turned to look at her with an expression of patient, fond exasperation. When has anything we've ever built been made worse by improvement? She opened her mouth. She closed it again. She looked at her notebook. I'm going to keep a record, she said, of everything that happens tonight, empirically. Brilliant, said Fred, who was no longer listening. Ron drifted to the window while Fred and George began unpacking the sign from its canvas. They worked with the careful attention that the twins only ever gave to things they had built themselves. Outside, it was getting properly dark. The lanterns were all lit. The alley had that particular evening quality of somewhere between open and asleep. Not quite either. A cat sat on the step of the apothecary next door, watching the street with the absolute indifference that cats bring to everything. A witch in a long traveling cloak hurried past the end of the alley with a bag over one arm, not looking up. Ron watched her go, and thought, without meaning to think it, that the alley had been quieter this summer than he remembered. Fewer people. The kind of quiet that wasn't entirely peaceful. The kind that comes not from contentment, but from caution. He'd noticed it coming in. The way the shopkeepers had their doors open but were still watching. The way people walked a little faster between one end and the other. The way Madame Malkin's girl had looked up quickly when their footsteps had come around the corner, and then looked back down again when it was only them. He didn't say any of this. There was no particular reason to say it. "Ron," Fred called from the back of the shop. "Stop brooding and come and hold this end." "I wasn't brooding. You had the face." "I don't have a face." "Everyone has a face," said George. "Yours is distinctly brooding adjacent. Come and hold the end." Ron came and held the end. The sign was heavier than it looked, which was saying something because it looked very heavy. It was made of dark-painted wood, deep enough blue-green that it was almost black in low light. The lettering, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, had been carved in and then filled with something that wasn't quite gold and wasn't quite light, but somewhere between the two. It caught every available warmth in the room and threw it back doubled. It was, Ron thought, holding his end with both hands while Fred and George made adjustments he didn't entirely follow, a genuinely good sign. He thought it would be the sort of thing he'd find embarrassing to admit, his brother's shop sign. But standing here, holding it in the half-built shop with the evening outside and Hermione scribbling in her notebook behind him, he found he didn't need to qualify it at all. It was a good sign. It looked like what it was supposed to look like. "What's the enchantment?" Hermione asked from somewhere over his left shoulder. "Atmospheric," said Fred. "Advertisement," said George. "Atmospheric advertisement," said Fred. "I need more than that," Hermione said. "It talks," said George, "when it wants to." "When it wants to?" "When it judges the moment appropriate," Fred said. "We've given it a reasonable amount of independent judgment." "You've given a shop sign," Hermione said, slowly, "independent judgment." "Limited," said Fred. "Reasonably limited," George confirmed. What does reasonably mean in this context? Neither of them answered immediately, which was, Hermione had long since learned, its own kind of answer. It took them the better part of an hour to mount the sign above the shop door, which required spell work. A ladder that had opinions about how steeply it wanted to be angled, and a brief but earnest disagreement between Fred and George about whether 4 inches to the left or 3 inches to the left was the correct adjustment. Ron held the ladder. Hermione held her notebook. At one point, the sign hummed. Not a mechanical hum, something warmer than that. Something that rose and faded, like a voice clearing its throat in a quiet room. "Did it just—" Ron started. "Yes," said George. "Is it meant to—" "Probably," said Fred. The sign hummed again, briefly, as though satisfied. When it was mounted, 4 inches to the left in the end, which Fred accepted with the graciousness of someone already planning to revisit the question, they stood back. All 4 of them. On the pavement outside the shop, looking up. In the lantern light, the sign was magnificent. The lettering glowed in that warm between gold and light color. The dark wood backdrop made the letter seem to float rather than sit on their surface. The shop windows below reflected the glow, and for a moment, just a moment, Diagon Alley seemed a little brighter at this particular stretch than it had anywhere else. "Right," said Fred. His hands were in his pockets. His voice had gone quieter than usual, the way it sometimes did when something he'd been thinking about for a long time had just become real. "Ready then?" "Ready," said George. "Hermione?" "I'm documenting," she said, which was not quite a yes, but was not a no either. "Ron?" Ron looked up at the sign. He looked at his brothers. He thought again, briefly, of the witch who had hurried past without looking up, and the cat on the apothecary's steps, and the particular careful quiet that Diagon Alley had been wearing all summer, like a coat that didn't quite fit. "Yeah," he said. "Go on then." Fred reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small device, almost certainly not as simple as it appeared. Nothing Fred and George built ever was. He held it up. He pressed it. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the sign lit. Not just glowed, lit in the fullest sense of the word, warm and sudden and unmistakably alive. The letters blazing gold against the dark wood and the dark evening sky, light spilling across the cobblestones below in long, warm stripes, the shop windows blazing with reflected brightness. And then, in a voice that was somehow both enormous and perfectly conversational, the voice of someone with a great deal to say and every confidence that you wanted to hear it, the sign spoke. "Attention, witches and wizards of Diagon Alley." "Oh no," said Hermione. "Your evening is about to improve significantly." Down the alley, 3 separate curtains twitched. The cat on the apothecary's step opened both eyes. Ron started to laugh. The sign had not finished. This was perhaps the first thing that should have been established more clearly before the activation. Hermione thought this, clearly, with considerable feeling. Whether the sign had a natural stopping point, whether it possessed any sense of occasion or proportion, whether reasonably limited independent judgment included the judgment to recognize when 4 people on a pavement were looking up at it with expressions ranging from delight to dawning horror, and to perhaps moderate itself accordingly. It did not appear to possess this judgment. "For too long," the sign continued, in the same magnificent conversational boom, "has Diagon Alley been without a proper establishment dedicated to the elevation of the human spirit." "Elevation of the—" Hermione started. "And the alleviation of everyday misery through the targeted application of carefully crafted—" "It's very loud," Ron observed. "Premium quality, humorous products." "Yes," said George, with the expression of a person watching something he built do exactly what he built it to do, which was not necessarily the same as what he intended it to do. "It is. Designed by the finest magical minds of the current generation." "That's us," Fred clarified, to no one who needed clarification. "Available exclusively at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, located here, at this very spot, which you are currently standing outside of." "It knows we're standing outside of it," Ron said. "Limited independent judgment," George said. "If you are standing outside of it, which several of you now are." And here was the thing that Hermione had been noting with increasing attention in her notebook since approximately the second sentence. The sign was correct. Several of them now were, standing outside it. The 3 curtains that had twitched earlier had produced, between them, 3 faces. 2 witches of middling age who appeared to live in the flat above the magical maintenance supplies shop, and the owner of the apothecary, Mr. Brimstone, a narrow man in his 60s with the perpetually suspicious expression of someone who has spent decades working with sulfur and has found it has affected his general outlook. All 3 of them were looking up at the sign, with different gradations of the same expression, the expression of someone who had not expected their evening to go this way. A couple had appeared at the far end of the alley. Not local, Hermione thought. Tourists, perhaps, or visitors to Gringotts who had lingered. They had stopped walking because the light from the sign was reaching them even at that distance. That warm gold light, spilling down the cobblestones like something poured. "Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," the sign announced, with the satisfaction of something that has been building to this moment. "Will open shortly. In the meantime." "In the meantime?" Fred said, with the specific alertness of someone who has just heard their own creation say something they did not program it to say. "George," Hermione said, "I heard it. Please enjoy this complimentary preview of several of our finest products." "George," Fred said. "I heard it," George said. "Did you program the complimentary preview?" George opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his brother with the particular expression that meant, "I programmed something in that general area, and it may have developed opinions." "In a manner of speaking," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means," George said, "that I gave it access to the product list for contextual authenticity, and it may have taken a more proactive approach to that access than I strictly intended." Fred stared at him. "It's showing initiative," George offered. "It's a sign," Fred said. "A sign with limited independent George. Judgment, yes, I know." George looked up at it. "This is actually quite impressive." "Product the first," the sign said, brightly. "The patented Daydream Charm. 60 seconds of total immersive fantasy. Ministry of Magic approved. Side effects may include—" Hermione was writing very fast. The thing about Diagon Alley in the evening, in summer, in 1996, was that it did not have a great deal of competition for attention. The days were long still, but turning, and people moved through the alley with the efficiency of errands rather than the ease of leisure. There was a quality to the summer that year which everyone felt and most people didn't discuss. A tightening, a held breath. The sensation of a sky that might or might not be about to do something, and the not entirely comfortable awareness that you couldn't tell which. People got what they needed and went home and locked the door, and didn't think too hard about what they'd seen in that morning's prophet. Which was why the light, when it came, warm, sudden, unmistakably festive, pulled people the way it did. Not running, nothing so dramatic, but the couple at the far end had begun walking toward it. Close together, the woman leaning slightly to see past the man's shoulder. A boy of perhaps 12 had appeared from somewhere with the instantaneous materialization that children achieve when something interesting is happening, and was now standing at the edge of the growing cluster on the pavement, craning his neck. Florian Fortescue himself had come out. He was a broad, comfortable-looking man who had the manner of someone to whom hospitality came naturally. He stood in the doorway of his parlor with his arms folded and his head tilted, looking at the sign with the expression of someone professionally appreciating good advertising. "Impressive," he said, to no one in particular. "Thank you," said Fred, who was still watching the sign with the alertness of a man watching a bonfire he'd started in what he'd believed was a safe location, but was no longer entirely certain about. "Product the third," the sign was saying, having moved through its roster with cheerful efficiency. "The nosebleed nougat. One end causes a convincing and medically impressive nosebleed. The other end stops it. Both ends taste of lemon. We are not responsible for consuming both ends simultaneously, which you should not do, and which we have explicitly labeled." "Have we explicitly labeled?" Ron asked. "There's a sticker," George said. "Do not consume both ends simultaneously." "There's a sticker," George confirmed to the assembled onlookers, with the calm authority of a man who has anticipated this question. The two, Witches from the flat above had come all the way down now. One of them was small and round, with silver hair pinned in a complicated arrangement. She was looking at the sign with the expression of someone who has just remembered that they quite like being surprised. The other was taller, younger, a shopping bag over one arm, with a distinct air of having been on her way somewhere when this happened. She had stopped anyway, the way you stop when something is happening that you find yourself wanting to see the end of. Mr. Brimstone, from the apothecary, had not moved from his doorway. But he had not gone back inside either, which Hermione had noted, and which she suspected was the closest Mr. Brimstone got to enthusiasm. She was standing slightly to one side of Fred and George, which was where she had strategically positioned herself, close enough to intervene if intervention became necessary, far enough away to not be immediately associated with the source of the spectacle. She had filled 3 pages already. Her handwriting had gotten smaller as the pages went on, which was what happened when she was writing quickly and thinking faster. The situation was not, she told herself, out of control. It was simply developing in ways that hadn't been fully anticipated. This was different from out of control. Out of control implied that no one had any idea what was happening. This was merely a situation in which everyone had partial ideas about what was happening, and the complete picture was still assembling itself. She wrote this down, then crossed it out. Product the 5th, the sign announced. The extendable ears, patent pending, a listening device of exceptional range and sensitivity, suitable for situations in which one wishes to know what is being said in an adjacent room, or a stairwell, or in controlled testing, through 2 separate closed doors and a particularly thick stone wall. How thick was the wall? The boy at 12 asked. He had worked his way to the front without anyone quite noticing. 14 inches, Fred said immediately. Solid granite, Scottish granite specifically, which is denser on average than the southern varieties. The boy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Does it work through water? Interesting question, said George. We haven't tested aquatic applications. Fred, Hermione said. Hermione. The sign is describing your products to a crowd of people, in detail, at considerable volume. I am aware of that. Doesn't that seem like brilliant advertising? I was going to say premature. The shop isn't open yet. Fred turned to look at her, with the expression he wore when he was about to say something technically reasonable, presented in a way designed to be maddening. Hermione, the shop isn't open yet. What better time to build anticipation? The sign is making claims I'm not sure you can legally substantiate. Such as? Hermione looked at her notes. The patented daydream charm. The most immersive magical experience available at any price point on the current market. We believe that to be accurate. Have you surveyed the current market? Comprehensively, Fred said, with the serenity of someone who has defined comprehensively in a way that would not survive academic scrutiny. Product the 7th, the sign said. How many products does it know about? Ron asked George. How many products do we have? Ron thought about it. I don't know. A lot. Then probably, George said. A lot. The crowd had, by now, achieved a size that could reasonably be called a crowd. Small, 10, perhaps 12 people, but gathered with the purposeful looseness of people who were watching something of their own accord, who could leave, but have decided not to. The couple from the far end of the alley had made their way all the way to the front. The woman was laughing at something Fred had just said. The man was looking at the sign with the expression of someone making a mental note of an address. 3 more children had appeared in the way that children always appear when something is happening that adults haven't specifically arranged. Florian Fortescue had crossed the alley entirely. He was now standing comfortably in the middle of things, with a small bowl of something pale and creamy that he appeared to have produced from nowhere. "Pistachio?" he offered Hermione. She blinked at the ice cream. She accepted it. This felt like the appropriate response. "They've been planning this a long time," Fortescue said, with the mild approval of someone who recognizes when a thing has been thought through. He was watching Fred and George rather than the sign, in the way that people who've been in business a while watch young people who are starting out, looking for something specific and finding it. "The sign is good." "The sign," Hermione said, "has independent judgment." "Most good ones do," Fortescue said, comfortably. She looked at him. She looked at her ice cream. She ate a spoonful and decided that this was not the moment to argue about shop signs with a man who had been running one of Diagon Alley's most beloved establishments for 20 years. "The Skiving Snack Box," the sign announced, with a flourish that manifested as a brief, warm intensification of its golden glow. "Contains no fewer than 12 distinct ailment-inducing and ailment-curing confections, each pair color-coded for your convenience. The complete box allows the consumer to simulate, at will, the following conditions." The sign began listing conditions. It listed them with impressive specificity and a certain relish that suggested the enchantment had genuine affection for this particular product. Ron, listening, began counting on his fingers. He got to 11 and ran out of fingers. "George," he said, "how long did it take to develop all of these?" "Depends what you mean by develop," George said. "How long were you working on the snack box, specifically?" George looked at the sign. He looked at Ron. There was something in his face when he looked at Ron sometimes. Something that wasn't quite pride, because it was more sideways than that. More like recognition. And it was there now, briefly, before he answered. "Started in 3rd year," he said. "Properly. Before that was just theory." "3rd year," Ron repeated. "You were in 1st year," George said. "You were very small." "I wasn't that small." "You were substantially small." Ron opened his mouth to object, and then decided, for reasons he didn't fully examine, not to bother. He looked back at the sign instead, and at the crowd, and at Fred, who was holding court at the center of it all with the ease of someone born to exactly this moment. And he thought about 3rd year, and theory, and all the time between then and now, and the shop that wasn't quite open yet, but had a sign that was making itself very clearly known to all of Diagon Alley. "Fainting fancies," the sign concluded, "which do exactly what they sound like, and which have been described by independent reviewers as—" "We haven't had independent reviewers," Hermione said. "Remarkably convincing." "George," Hermione said. "Technically," George said, "Percy fainted quite convincingly in the initial testing, and he is, in a sense, independent." Hermione stared at him. "He wasn't particularly pleased about it," George acknowledged, "but the data was useful." From somewhere behind the crowd, the sound of laughter. Real, surprised laughter. The kind that escapes before you've decided whether to let it. It came from the small, round witch with the silver hair. She had apparently reached her limit of keeping a straight face and abandoned the effort entirely. It was a warm sound in the evening air, the kind of sound that carries further than it should in a quiet street, the kind that makes the people around you start to smile without knowing why. The sign glowed. The cobblestones shone with reflected gold, and Hermione, despite everything, despite her notebook and her 3 pages of observations and her entirely reasonable concerns about legal substantiation and independently verified product claims, found the corners of her mouth doing something she hadn't entirely approved. She ate another spoonful of pistachio ice cream. "Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," the sign said, settling into something comfortable, like a story. Finding its ending. Where the magic is always meant to make you smile. And then, as though it had simply decided that this was a good place to rest, the sign fell into a glowing, satisfied quiet. The crowd, caught off guard by the silence, stood for a moment. Then someone began to clap. Florian Fortescue joined in first, which meant everyone else did too, because Florian Fortescue was the sort of man whose approval made other people more confident in their own. Fred Weasley turned to face his audience. He spread his arms wide, in the manner of a man entirely at home in this moment, and bowed. The applause didn't last long. It never does in the open air, where sound disperses rather than collects, where people are aware, in a way they aren't inside, of how they must look to anyone passing by, standing in a street, clapping at a shop sign. It faded quickly and naturally, the way applause does when it has served its purpose, and what was left after it was something quieter and more interesting. The specific social atmosphere of a group of strangers who have just shared something and are now deciding individually and collectively what to do about that. Most of them stayed. This was the thing that Fred noticed, and that George noticed, and that Hermione noticed from her slightly removed position with her ice cream and her notebook. That the reasonable, sensible thing, the thing that the evening hour and the closed shops and the general atmosphere of a wizarding world with other things on its mind would have suggested, was to nod politely and continue on with the evening. To remember the name of the shop, perhaps. To come back when it opened. Most of them stayed anyway. The small round witch with the silver hair, her name was Mrs. Puddifoot, though not that Mrs. Puddifoot, a different one entirely, had settled herself on a crate that someone had moved near the shop door. She showed every sign of being comfortable for the foreseeable future. She had a bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and the expression of someone who has decided that this is simply where she is now, and is content with that. The tall witch with the shopping bag had introduced herself to George as Lavinia Beach, a seamstress by trade. She lived above the apothecary and had been meaning to do something about the evening for the past 3 hours, and hadn't, and was now, she said, very glad. She was looking at the half-built interior of the shop with professional interest, the way people in trades always look at spaces, measuring and imagining simultaneously, calculating what could go where. The couple from the far end of the alley were the Carmichaels, Marcus and Beatrice. They'd been to Gringotts and had stayed too long discussing exchange rates and had missed their flu connection. Simply extending the evening in an unexpected direction, Beatrice said. Marcus Carmichael had the look of a man who spent most of his time being sensible and was finding the holiday from it rather pleasant. The boy of 12, whose name nobody had established yet, because nobody had thought to ask, and who showed no inclination to offer it, had positioned himself very close to the shop's open door. He was looking at the boxes inside with the focused attention of someone inventorying possibilities. and Mr. Brimstone, from the apothecary, had not joined the crowd exactly, but had not gone back inside either. He stood in his own doorway with his arms folded, watching proceedings over the heads of the people between them, with the expression of a man who refuses on principle to be entertained, and is finding this principle increasingly difficult to maintain. Florian Fortescue, for his part, had gone back to his parlor, but had returned within 5 minutes with a tray of small paper cups, raspberry, pistachio, honeycomb, which he was distributing with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who considers feeding people a basic courtesy, like holding a door open. It was Fred who understood first what the evening had become. He'd expected the sign. He'd expected the light, the sound, the initial attention. They'd calculated all of that, or George had, with the particular brand of calculation that the twins applied to their work. Rigorous in its way, but operating from different premises than Hermione's. He'd expected people to look. He had not entirely expected people to stay. And now that they had, now that there was this small, warm cluster of people on the pavement outside a shop that didn't officially exist yet, eating Florian Fortescue's ice cream in the evening air and looking at him with the specific expression of people who are ready to be interested, he felt something settle in him that had been unsteady for longer than he'd acknowledged. He caught George's eye across the small crowd. George gave him the look, the particular one, the one that meant, "I know, and yes, and go on then." Fred turned back to the crowd. "Right," he said, with the easy warmth of someone stepping into a room they've furnished themselves. "While we have you," he started talking about the shop the way he always talked about everything that mattered to him. Sideways, through jokes and specifics and the occasional digression that turned out not to be a digression at all. He talked about the skiving snack box and the daydream charms and the extendable ears and the sign itself, which was still glowing quietly above them all with the satisfied air of something that knows it has done its job. He talked about the development process with the selective honesty of a born storyteller, including the spectacular failures, because the failures were always funnier, and also because people trusted you more when you admitted them. The boy of 12, whose name turned out to be Callum, established when Mrs. Puddifoot asked him directly, in the tone of a woman who has never found it difficult to ask children their names, wanted to know about the failures specifically. This was a boy after Fred's own heart. The Tun-Tung Toffee, Fred said, had 3 separate prototype stages, the second of which resulted in a tongue that grew to approximately, "Fred," Hermione said, "a remarkable length, which we have since calibrated. The specifics perhaps aren't—" "She worries," Fred told Callum, in a stage whisper that carried to all corners of the gathering. "It's affectionate." Hermione wrote something in her notebook with considerable force. George had drifted to the shop's interior, moving among the boxes with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided something without announcing it. Hermione noticed this first, because Hermione noticed most things first. She watched him open a box, look at its contents, look at the crowd, look back at the contents, and she felt a very specific and not entirely comfortable premonition. "George," she said. Said George, which was not a response exactly. "What are you doing?" "Just looking." She looked at her notebook. She looked at George. She looked at the open box, which contained something small and brightly wrapped, and which was humming faintly. "George, the shop isn't open." "Demonstrating," George said, with perfect serenity, "is not the same as selling. That is a legal distinction I would want to examine very carefully before—" Hermione. George looked at her then, properly, with the directness that he deployed more sparingly than Fred, and which, precisely because of that, carried more weight. Look at them. She looked. Mrs. Puddifoot with her folded hands. Lavinia Beach with her measuring gaze gone soft around the edges. The Carmichaels, close together. Beatrice's hand through Marcus's arm. Callum, who had clearly forgotten entirely that he was supposed to be anywhere else. And Mr. Brimstone, who still had his arms folded, but had moved, sometime in the last 10 minutes, from his own doorstep to the edge of the gathered group, which was 3 steps further than anyone would have predicted. They want to see something, George said, and we have something to show them. Hermione looked at him. She looked at her notebook. She thought about legal distinctions, and unopened shop hours, and the half-finished counter inside. And then she thought about the particular careful quiet that had been sitting over Diagon Alley all summer, like a lid on something. She clicked her pen. She turned to a fresh page. I'm documenting everything, she said. You're a treasure, George said, and meant it, and turned back to his box. Ron had found a good spot. This was something he was quietly excellent at, finding the right position in a space. The place from which you could see everything without being in the middle of it. Not hiding exactly, more like the instinct of someone who was grown up in a house with a great many people and learned early that the best view of any situation was rarely from the center of it. He was leaning against the wall to the left of the shop door, close enough to be part of things, far enough to see all of it. He had a cup of honeycomb ice cream from Fortescue's tray, which he was eating with the unhurried pleasure of someone who has no particular responsibilities at this moment and is aware of that fact and grateful for it. He watched Fred hold court, with the comfortable recognition of someone who has watched this particular performance his whole life. The ease of it, the naturalness, the way Fred made everyone in a conversation feel as though they were the person he'd most been hoping to talk to. Some people performed warmth. Fred simply had it, and allowed it to extend outward until it covered whoever was standing nearby. He watched George move through the shop with a focused quiet that was George's version of the same thing. The care, the attention, the way he handled each item as though it mattered, not just as a product, but as a thing that had taken time and thought to make. Because it had. Ron knew that better than most. He'd watched them work over the years, at kitchen tables and in the bedroom at the Burrow with the door shut, heard the scratch of quills, the occasional muffled bang, his mum's voice rising from downstairs in response to the bang, and the muffled laughter that followed. He watched Hermione write in her notebook, and then look up at something Fred said, and then write again. He watched Mrs. Puddifoot accept a second cup of ice cream from Fortescue with the dignity of someone who considers this a perfectly reasonable decision. He watched Callum inch closer to the shop door, drawn by some irresistible gravity toward the boxes inside. The sign glowed above all of it. The alley was still quiet beyond their small circle of warmth and light, still wearing its careful summer hush. But here, in this particular spot, something else was happening. Something that didn't have a name exactly, but that Ron recognized the shape of. He ate the last of his ice cream. He stood in his good spot. He watched his brothers. The evening was nowhere near done yet. George produced the box with the quiet ceremony of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided, unilaterally, that this is it. It was a medium-sized box, plain on the outside, in the way that things are plain when the plainness is deliberate, when someone has made a choice to let the contents do the announcing. He set it on the shop counter, the most finished surface available, and opened it with the unhurried ease of someone who is not performing but is aware of being watched and has made peace with that distinction. Inside, nestled in compartments fitted with a kind of care usually reserved for things more fragile than joke products, was the first complete run of the skiving snack box. 12 pairs of sweets, each pair in its own small section. Each section labeled in handwriting that was neater than Fred's and more decisive than George's, which meant it was the handwriting they used when something mattered. The careful in-between script they developed over years of shared notebooks and collaborative theory. The colors were deliberate, each ailment-inducing half in one shade, each curing half in its complement. The whole thing had the appearance of something that had been thought about for a long time, and made well. The crowd, which had gathered loosely around the counter with the organic drift of people following interest, looked at it with varying expressions. Mrs. Puddifoot looked charmed. Lavinia Beach looked analytically curious. Marcus Carmichael looked like a man doing calculations. Beatrice Carmichael looked at Marcus doing calculations, and then looked at the snack box instead. Callum looked at it the way 12-year-olds look at anything that promises consequence. "The skiving snack box," George said, without preamble, without showmanship, in the tone of someone who trusts the thing to speak for itself. 12 ailments, 12 cures. Color-coded for convenience, clearly labeled, and tested extensively. "By whom?" Hermione asked from her position slightly to the left, pen ready. "Volunteers," George said. "Willing volunteers?" "Largely," George said. Hermione wrote this down. "The concept," Fred said, appearing at George's shoulder with the timing of someone who has done this particular double act long enough that cues have become instinct, is simple. One end makes you ill. The other end makes you better. The window between them is long enough to excuse yourself from any given situation. He paused, with the expression of someone selecting a neutral example from a long list of specific ones. A classroom, say, or a particularly tedious meeting, or a family occasion that has run significantly past its natural conclusion. "Fred," Hermione said, "and short enough that no lasting harm is done. The whole thing is, from a regulatory standpoint, entirely above board." "Is it?" Hermione said. "We intend it to be," Fred said, which was a different thing. But he said it with such confidence that the distinction blurred a little in the warm evening air. The first demonstration was Ron's fault, though this was disputed afterward, with some vigor. His position near the door had been comfortable and observational and entirely non-participatory, and he would have maintained it, he felt, indefinitely, if Fred hadn't turned and looked at him with the expression that Fred had been deploying against Ron's better judgment since approximately 1988. "Ron," Fred said. "No," said Ron. "I haven't asked yet." "You have the face." "I have a face. It's my face. It doesn't imply anything." "It implies everything," Ron said. "I know that face. Mum knows that face. That face has been directly responsible for at least 4 separate occasions when—" "Ron," Fred said, with great patience, "it's one sweet, for demonstration purposes, in front of witnesses." "In front of witnesses," Ron repeated. "That's meant to reassure me?" "It means," George said helpfully, that if anything goes wrong, there are people here who can confirm the timeline. Ron looked at the assembled crowd. Mrs. Puddifoot was watching him with the encouraging expression of someone who would like to see what happens next. Callum had the focused attention of a boy who's been waiting for exactly this development. Even Mr. Brimstone, still at the edge of the group, arms still folded, had a quality of watchfulness that suggested participation in all but posture. He looked at Hermione. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who disapproves of the situation but recognizes that it has already been decided. "Fine," Ron said. He pushed off from the wall. "Which one?" Fred selected a sweet from the snack box with the careful consideration of someone choosing the right tool. Not the most dramatic, not the most alarming, but the one that would make the best case. He held it up, small and orange, wrapped in paper that crinkled softly when he turned it. "Nosebleed nougat," he said. "Orange and first. You'll have about 30 seconds before the cure kicks in automatically." He looked at Ron. "Don't tilt your head back." "Why would I?" "Just don't." Ron took the sweet. He looked at it. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Fred, with an expression that communicated several things clearly, including, "I am doing this under protest," and "I am aware this is exactly what you wanted." And underneath both of those, in smaller letters, "This had better be good." He ate it. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then Ron's nose began to bleed, with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for an opportunity. The crowd reacted with the mixed delight of people who had been promised a demonstration and are now receiving one. A collective intake of breath followed immediately by laughter, followed by Hermione producing a handkerchief from somewhere about her person with the practiced speed of someone who has been friends with Ron Weasley for 5 years and has learned to anticipate. "Don't tilt," Fred started. Ron tilted his head back. "Your head back," Fred finished. "That's instinct," Ron said. "Override the instinct." "I can't override the instinct. It's instinct. That's what—" Ron stopped, blinked, and the bleeding stopped, with the completeness of a tap being turned. He lowered his head. He looked at Fred with an expression of profound betrayal. Fred looked at George. George looked at the crowd. 32 seconds, George said, slightly ahead of schedule. The crowd applauded. Callum applauded loudest. Mrs. Puddifoot was wiping her eyes, which could have been laughter or sympathy, or some combination of the two. Hermione handed Ron the handkerchief, with the resigned care of a person who had predicted this outcome and had prepared accordingly. "Effective," Lavinia Beach said, with professional fairness. "I'm putting this in the record," Hermione said, writing. "Please do," Fred said. 32 seconds is a personal best. The second demonstration was George's idea, and it went slightly differently. He produced the daydream charm from a separate box, with an air of ceremony that suggested this was the one he'd been building toward, not the warm-up act, the centerpiece. It was a small foil package, silver and faintly iridescent, and it had a quality that was harder to describe than the snack box's clean practicality, something that made you feel, looking at it, that it contained more than its size suggested. 60 seconds of total immersive experience, George said. Complete sensory engagement. The ministry classification is... He paused. Pending. Pending, Hermione repeated. We submitted the application, George said. They haven't refused. Not having refused is different from Hermione. It's 60 seconds, not a lifetime commitment. The Carmichaels exchanged a glance, the kind that long-standing couples exchange when they are making a joint decision without speaking. Beatrice looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the daydream charm, with the expression of a man who has been sensible for a very long time. "I'll try it," Beatrice Carmichael said. Fred smiled the smile of someone whose evening is going well. He handed it over with the same care George had shown the snack box. Not carelessness, never carelessness with the things they'd made, and talked her through it in terms that were clear and unhurried and precise. She opened the package. She held the charm. She looked at her husband. "Back in 60 seconds, she said. "I'll be here," he said. She closed her eyes. For 60 seconds, Beatrice Carmichael was somewhere else entirely. Where she went, she didn't say afterward, and nobody asked, because it had the quality of something private. But her face, in those 60 seconds, had the soft, unguarded expression of someone experiencing something genuinely good. Not performed contentment, not the polite enjoyment of an adequate experience. The real thing. The kind that rearranges your face without your permission. Marcus Carmichael watched her, with an expression that Ron, from his good spot by the wall, saw but couldn't quite name. Not worry, not impatience. Something quieter than both. The expression of a man watching someone he loves be, briefly, very happy. At 60 seconds exactly, Beatrice opened her eyes. She looked at the packaging in her hand. She looked at Fred and George. She looked at her husband. "Oh," she said. It was a small word for what she appeared to mean by it. "Good?" Marcus asked. "Very," she said. The crowd was quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something real has just happened in their midst. Not subdued, but stilled. The laughter from the nosebleed nougat had been warm and communal. This was different. This was the specific hush of people who have just been reminded that the thing being discussed is not just clever, but genuinely, carefully made. Fred was watching the Carmichaels, with an expression Ron hadn't seen on him in a while. Not performance, not showmanship, not the bright front that Fred showed the world when the world was watching. Something underneath that. George, beside him, said nothing. He didn't need to. The third demonstration was nobody's idea, precisely. It emerged the way several things that evening had emerged, organically, from the specific combination of Callum's curiosity, an inadequately sealed box, and the fact that Fred had been talking with both hands and had set something down without fully securing it. The something was a prototype. A fairly early prototype, George clarified afterward, with emphasis on the word early, which carried implications about its reliability that became relevant approximately 4 seconds after Callum, reaching past Fred to look at something in the box, accidentally knocked it open. What came out was small and purple and moved with a velocity that suggested it had been waiting. It went up. It went sideways. It made a sound that was somewhere between a sneeze and a small brass instrument. It deposited a cloud of bright purple something, fine and enthusiastic, across an area that included Fred's left shoulder, a significant portion of the counter, and, most decisively, Ron. Ron turned purple. Not dramatically purple, not alarmingly purple. A definite, unambiguous, even rather pleasant shade of purple, applied uniformly from approximately the collar upward. Hermione stopped writing. The crowd stared. Ron looked at his hands. "George," he said. "That's a very early prototype," George said. "George, the color is temporary." How temporary? George looked at Fred. Fred looked at the ceiling. The ceiling offered nothing useful. Reasonably temporary, Fred said. That word again, Hermione said, faintly. Ron looked at Mrs. Puddifoot, who was making a valiant effort not to laugh and losing by a considerable margin. He looked at Callum, who had already lost the effort entirely and was not trying to recover it. He looked at Mr. Brimstone, who had unfolded his arms. Mr. Brimstone was smiling. Not broadly, not warmly, not in any way that would have been recognizable as a smile on most people, but the corners of his mouth had moved in an upward direction, and the furrow between his brows had eased. And for one moment in the evening lamplight, he looked less like a man who had spent too long with sulphur, and more like a man who remembered, dimly, what it was like to be surprised. Ron looked at all of this. He looked at his purple hands, and then he started to laugh. Not the polite laugh of someone making the best of a situation, the real one, the helpless kind, the kind that takes hold before you've decided to let it, that comes from somewhere below decision-making entirely, the kind that Fred and George had always been able to produce in him since before he could properly remember, since the very beginning of having brothers. The crowd laughed with him, and the sign above the door, which had been resting in its quiet golden glow, pulsed once, warm and brief and fond, like something that was pleased with how the evening was going. Hermione had 4 pages of notes. This was, under the circumstances, either an impressive achievement or a damning indictment of how thoroughly the evening had escaped any recognizable category of order. She hadn't yet decided which. The pages were dense, her handwriting having compressed itself across the paper with the efficiency of someone trying to keep pace with events that were not keeping pace with her. There were underlined sections. There were marginal annotations. There was, on page 3, a small diagram that she had drawn during the Daydream Charm demonstration and subsequently crossed out, because diagrams implied she was treating this as a research exercise, which she was not. She was simply documenting, for accuracy, in case anyone asked later. She turned to page 5. Ron was still faintly purple. The shade had softened somewhat from its original declaration, moved from assertive to merely present, the way strong colors sometimes do when they decide to negotiate. He'd examined his reflection in the shop window, with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has been surprised by his own brothers enough times that surprise itself has ceased to surprise him, and had returned to his spot by the wall, arms folded, expression that of a man who has decided that purple, in the right light, is not without its dignity. Fred was demonstrating the extendable ears to Callum, with the focused enthusiasm of a natural teacher, which Fred was in the particular way of people who would never describe themselves as teachers, but whose explanations are somehow always clearer than other people's. He had one end of the flesh-colored string pressed against the wall, and was directing Callum, with the other end, toward the far corner of the shop, narrating the results with the running commentary of someone who considers silence a missed opportunity. George had returned to the boxes. This was what Hermione was watching. George at the boxes, moving through them with the quiet attention she'd observed earlier, but now with a specific quality of decision. The look of someone who has identified a problem, has a solution, and is in the process of implementing it before anyone raises objections. She recognized this look. She had this look herself sometimes, and found it useful, which was precisely why she recognized it as dangerous in other people. "George," she said. "Hermione," he said, without turning. "What are you getting out?" "Just organizing." "That's not organizing. That's finding something specific." He turned then. He was holding a box that was slightly larger than the others, plain-sided, sealed with a simple clasp. And he had the expression of someone who's been found out and is deciding whether to be transparent about it, or whether transparency, in this instance, might simply generate more paperwork. "It's the Skiving Snack Box second run," he said. "Complete version. 12 ailments, all pairs calibrated. George, the shop is not open. Demonstration purposes." You keep saying demonstration purposes as though it's a legal framework. It's a conceptual framework. That's worse. She stepped toward him. "Listen to me. You have 10, possibly 11 if Mr. Brimstone counts, and I think he counts, members of the public outside this shop, which is not open, watching you handle products that do not yet have full ministry approval. The approval is pending, yes, you've mentioned. And I would like to discuss what pending means in the context of the Potions and Potion-Adjacent Products Regulation Act of 1947, which covers confections with physiological effects, which these clearly are, and which, Hermione, requires completed safety documentation before public demonstration. Not pending documentation. Completed documentation. And I have not seen completed documentation. I have seen a notebook with some very good theory and 2 promising trial results, and a 3rd trial result that turned Ron purple. Temporarily purple. Still purple, George. Lighter purple. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the box in his hands, and at the shop around them, half-built and warm-lit and smelling of sawdust and potential, and at the crowd outside the window, visible through the glass, grouped loosely in the lantern light with the relaxed quality of people who've stopped being in a hurry and are not yet thinking about starting again. She thought about the approval application, which she had, in fact, helped Fred draft in early July, sitting at the kitchen table at the Burrow while Mrs. Weasley made soup and radio wizarding played something jaunty in the background. She knew, therefore, that the application was thorough. She knew it covered the relevant provisions. She knew that the ministry's pending status was administrative rather than substantive. The queue was long, the department understaffed, and the twins' application had been acknowledged and flagged for expedited review on the grounds of completeness. She knew all of this. She also knew that none of it technically changed the regulatory position. "One more demonstration," she said. "Supervised. I'm watching everything." George smiled. Not a triumphant smile. It was warmer than that, more genuine. The smile of someone who has just been reminded that the person arguing with him is arguing from a position of actual care, rather than opposition for its own sake. "You're always watching everything," he said. "It's one of your best qualities." She pointed her pen at him. "Don't." He went outside with the box, and she followed, because supervision required proximity, and she had a fresh page. The portrait situation developed independently. This was the phrase Hermione used in her notes. Developed independently. Because it was accurate, and also because she needed language that didn't imply she had failed to prevent it, which she had, but through no fault of reasonable anticipation. The portrait in question had been in the window of the establishment next to the apothecary, the magical maintenance supplies shop, for as long as anyone in the immediate vicinity could remember. It depicted a witch of late middle age in practical robes, with the expression of someone who has managed inventory for several decades and has found the experience instructive. Her name, painted in small letters on a card below the frame, was Edwina Crabbe. She had, until this evening, conducted herself with the mild background presence of most shop portraits, watching the street, occasionally commenting to neighboring portraits, maintaining the general dignity of the genre. The evening, however, had clearly provided sufficient stimulus to move her from mild background presence to active participant. "Young man," she said to Fred through the window of the maintenance supplies shop, in the carrying voice of someone who has spent years being heard over the sound of industrial cleaning equipment. Fred turned. He looked at the portrait. "Evening." "That sign," Edwina Crabbe said, "is 8 inches too far to the left." Hermione looked up from her notebook. Fred looked at George. George looked at the sign. "It's 4 inches too far to the left," Fred said. "We established that." "8," said Edwina Crabbe, with absolute confidence. "I have been looking at this stretch of wall for 31 years. I know what level looks like." "With respect," Fred said, "you're also hanging at a slight angle yourself, which may affect your—" "Frederick," Hermione said, in the tone she reserved for moments when Fred was about to make a situation significantly worse. "I'm just raising a measurement question." "I am not," Edwina Crabbe said, with considerable dignity, "hanging at a slight angle. I am hanging at the angle at which I was placed, which was done by a professional. All I'm saying is that perpendicular perception is relative when—" "Fred," Hermione said. "George agrees with me. George, tell her." George, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man observing a weather event he has no power over, said, "I think perhaps we should take all measurements as approximate." 4 inches, Fred said. 8, said Edwina Crabbe. 6, said Mrs. Puddifoot, who had been listening from her crate with the focused engagement of someone who considers this a reasonable field for input. 3 people looked at her. 6 seems like a reasonable middle position, she said, with mild defensiveness. Hermione turned to a fresh page. She was no longer writing notes about the demonstration. She was writing notes about this, because this had become the more interesting document. Ron had been watching Hermione for the last several minutes, not because he lacked other things to watch. The demonstration was ongoing. George had produced the second snack box and was walking through the ailment pairs with Lavinia Beach, who turned out to have a professional interest in the physiological side that went considerably beyond casual curiosity. Callum was asking Fred questions in the rapid, sustained way of someone who has identified a willing source and intends to use it fully. Mr. Brimstone had, at some point, moved to within comfortable conversational distance of the group, examining the snack box packaging with the critical attention of a man who works with compounds and has opinions about labeling standards. All of this was happening. Ron was aware of it. But Hermione had caught his attention in the way she sometimes did. Not dramatically, not because she was doing anything remarkable, but because she was doing the thing she always did, which was caring about all of it, and doing so in the particular way she had, through notes and frameworks and gentle argument, and the specific refusal to simply let things go unexamined. She was talking to George now, low and quick, going through something in her notebook that she was holding open with one hand while gesturing with the other. And George was listening with the attention he gave to things that mattered, not performing agreement, actually updating. Ron had spent 5 years watching people dismiss Hermione in the moment and find out later that she'd been right. He'd also spent 5 years watching her learn, slowly and sometimes with difficulty, when to press and when to let go. Which of those was more useful in any given situation? She was still learning that. She'd be the first to say so. But she was better at it than she'd been. And watching her now, the notebook, the pen, the careful argument, the genuine investment in whether George had his regulatory ducks in a row, he thought she was probably the best thing that had ever happened to this whole enterprise. That Fred and George probably knew it, that nobody would ever say so in those terms, because that wasn't how any of them talked. But it was true regardless. He pushed off from the wall and went to stand near her, in the easy way of someone who doesn't need a reason to move closer to his friends. Hermione glanced at him. "Still purple," she said. "Lighter purple," he said. "Marginally. I think it suits me." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression she sometimes had, the one that meant she was going to say something and then deciding not to. And the not saying was its own kind of warmth. She looked back at her notebook. "He doesn't have the secondary interaction documentation," she said, meaning George. "If someone takes the nosebleed nougat and then the fainting fancies within the same hour, there's no data on compound effects." "Is that likely to happen?" "It's more likely to happen now that we've demonstrated both in front of 12 people. "Fair," Ron said. "I've told him he needs to run the compound trials before opening." "Will he?" She looked at George, who was now showing Mrs. Puttyfoot the color-coding system with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, and at Fred, who had produced something new from somewhere and was holding it up in the lantern light for Callum to examine. "Yes," she said, not reluctant, not surprised, but settled, like something she'd thought about and arrived at. "I think he will." She clicked her pen. She looked at the crowd, and the sign, and the warm gold light falling across the cobblestones. "They're good at this," she said, not loudly, just to Ron, just for the record. Ron looked at his brothers. "Yeah," he said. "They really are." The evening had thinned, the way evenings do when they've been generous. Not ended, not yet, but the particular quality of it had shifted, the way a fire shifts when the largest log is caught and the initial brightness has settled into something steadier and deeper. The crowd had found its natural size and stopped growing. People had arranged themselves comfortably in the loose way of groups that have been standing together long enough to stop being strangers, without quite becoming something else. Conversations had divided and subdivided. George and Lavinia Beach were still deep in something technical near the counter. Hermione had been drawn into what appeared to be a surprisingly engaged exchange with Mr. Brimstone about the chemistry of the nosebleed nougat. And Mrs. Puddifoot had found in the Carmichaels exactly the kind of audience she hadn't known she was looking for. Callum had, at some point in the last half hour, migrated from the pavement into the shop itself, by increments so gradual that nobody had registered the transition. He was now sitting on an upturned crate near the window, listening to Fred with the concentrated attention of someone who has stopped performing interest and is simply, genuinely, interested. Fred was perched on the counter, the finished end, legs dangling, voice in the register it took on when he wasn't performing either, when he was just talking. Ron noticed the shift. He noticed most shifts, in the way of someone who had spent his life reading rooms that contained a great many people with strong personalities, and had learned early that the most important things in any room were usually happening slightly to the side of the main event. He drifted toward the shop door, not inside. He stayed in the frame, one shoulder against the painted wood, so that he was neither in nor out, which suited the moment. Fred was telling Callum about the daydream charm. Not the demonstration version, not the pitch, not the product description, but the actual version, the one underneath the pitch, where it had come from, what they'd been trying to do. The idea, Fred was saying, his voice had the quality it occasionally had when he was being precise about something he cared about, wasn't to make something flashy. The flashy part is just the packaging. The actual idea was simpler than that. Callum waited. He was, Ron noted, a good listener for 12. He had the patience of someone who has learned that the interesting part comes after the pause. People need somewhere to go, Fred said. In their heads. Somewhere good. Somewhere that's entirely theirs. He looked at the Daydream charm packaging on the counter beside him. That small, silver, iridescent square. 60 seconds. That's nothing, really. That's not even a full minute. But 60 seconds of somewhere genuinely good. He paused. That's worth something. Right now, specifically, that's worth quite a lot. He said right now, the way people say it when they mean something more than the current moment. When they mean the shape of things, the particular texture of this particular time. Callum looked at the packaging. He was 12, and 12 is old enough to understand the shape of things, even if the full weight of them hasn't landed yet. Because of everything, he said, which was the way young people named what adults spoke around carefully. Because of everything, Fred said. Yes. Ron stood in the doorway and listened and didn't move. The conversation ended naturally, the way Fred's conversations always ended, not with a conclusion, but with a pivot. Fred catching himself in the vicinity of seriousness and redirecting with the reflex of someone who has decided, at some fundamental level, that his job is to face toward the light and bring people with him. He showed Callum the prototype that had escaped earlier, explained what it was meant to do, and what it had done instead. Callum laughed, and the moment passed into the general warmth of the evening. But Fred stayed on the counter after that, while George took over the conversation with Callum. And he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Most of Fred's quiet was temporary, a breath between sentences, a pause before the next thing. This was the other kind. The kind that comes when something real has just been said out loud, and is now sitting in the air, needing a moment. Ron came fully inside. He didn't say anything. He leaned against the wall near the counter, close enough, and looked out through the shop window at the alley, at the cobblestones and the lantern light, and the small group of people still gathered in the warm radius of the sign's glow. From inside the shop, with the evening behind them, the scene had a quality that was almost like looking at something framed, like a picture of something, like something worth remembering. Fred looked out at the same view. For a little while, neither of them said anything, which was unusual for them as brothers, but not uncomfortable. Silence between siblings has different registers. This one was companionable, the silence of two people standing in the same understanding. "Do you think they'll come?" Fred said finally, not looking at Ron, looking at the alley. "When we open, do you think people will actually come?" "Are you serious?" Ron said. "I'm asking." Ron looked at him. Fred was not, he thought, actually asking whether people would come. The evidence of that was standing outside the window in the lantern light, talking and laughing and clutching snack box packaging. He was asking something else, and the something else was harder to put into words. And Ron wasn't sure he could put it into words, but he understood the shape of it. "They came tonight," Ron said, "and we weren't even open." Fred didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Mr. Brimstone, who had, in the last few minutes, done something remarkable. He had laughed, properly, audibly, with his whole face, at something Hermione had said. Hermione, of all people. And the laughter had transformed him briefly into a different version of himself. A version that was perhaps closer to the original. The one that existed before decades of sulfur and caution had applied their particular patina. That's the thing, though, Fred said, isn't it? They were hungry for it. Ron looked at the crowd, at Mrs. Puddifoot, still on her crate, showing Beatrice Carmichael something on the lining of her bag with animated pride. At Marcus Carmichael, who had bought nothing and agreed to nothing, and had simply stood in the lamplight for the better part of an hour, being somewhere other than wherever he'd been in his head before the sign lit. At Callum, who was now showing George something on his own hand with the enthusiasm of someone who has just thought of an application that the inventor hadn't, which was, for a 12-year-old, remarkably good. Yeah, Ron said. They were. Fred looked at the Daydream Charm packaging, still in his hand. He set it down on the counter with a care that was almost gentle. "We're going to be busy," he said. It sounded like something he was telling himself as much as Ron, reminding himself of something he already believed, but needed to hear said in a real voice, in a real room, with the evidence of it visible through a real window. "Merlin, I hope so," Ron said. Fred looked at him. For a moment, brief, unguarded, the performance was entirely absent, and he was simply Fred, which was a person Ron knew better than almost anyone, and thought about less often than he should. Because Fred was always there, had always been there, and the people who are always there are easy to forget to look at properly. "Thanks for coming tonight," Fred said. "You and Hermione both." As if we weren't going to. She could have been at the library. "She's basically at the library," Ron said. "She has a notebook." Fred smiled. The real one. Not the performance smile, which was also real but was for the crowd. The one that was just his face doing what it did when something landed right. "She's good for it," he said. "The business. She'll make sure we don't accidentally poison anyone." "You weren't going to accidentally poison anyone." "Almost certainly not." Fred picked up the packaging, then put it down again. "The compound interaction thing she mentioned. Has she talked to you about that?" "Briefly." "She's right about it. We need the data before opening." He said it simply, without resistance, in the tone of someone who has processed an objection and reached a conclusion. "I'll tell George." Ron thought about saying, "She'll be pleased," and decided against it, because Fred knew that, and saying it would make it into a larger thing than it needed to be. Instead, he said nothing, and they both looked out at the alley again. The sign had been quiet for a while. Not off, still glowing, still casting its warm gold light across the cobblestones, but the voice had gone still, and the sign had settled into something that was less announcement and more presence, like a hearth that has stopped crackling and is simply radiating. It had said what it had to say, and was now resting in the aftermath of it. Which was, Hermione thought, looking at it from the pavement, perhaps the most sensible thing it had done all evening. She had put her notebook away. This was not a decision she had consciously made. It had happened gradually. A page unturned, a pen uncapped, and then recapped. The documentation impulse quieting by degrees as the evening had deepened into something that felt less like an event to be recorded and more like a thing to simply be inside of. She still had opinions about the compound interaction data. She still intended to speak to George seriously about the regulatory timeline before the week was out. None of that had changed, but the notebook was in her pocket, and her hands were free, and she was standing on the cobblestones of Diagon Alley on a summer evening with warm light on her face, and that was sufficient. Mr. Brimstone appeared beside her. He had the manner of someone who has decided to say something and is taking his time approaching it. "The orange packaging," he said, "on the nosebleed nougat." "Yes?" "The compound they're using for the staunching effect. I recognized the base." He paused. He was looking at the sign rather than at her. Clever combination. Unusual, but it follows sound principles. "You could tell from the packaging?" "From the color of the curing suite, and from the smell when young Weasley opened the box." He folded his arms again, but differently. Not the defensive fold of earlier. Something more like the fold of a man settling into his own expertise. "They've thought it through. It's not slapdash." "No," Hermione said. "It isn't." Mr. Brimstone nodded once, in the manner of a verdict delivered. "I'll come to the opening," he said, "when they open." And he turned and went back inside his shop, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Hermione standing with that sentence and the various things it contained. She looked at the sign. She looked at the warm light on the cobblestones. She looked at Fred, visible through the window, still on the counter, and Ron beside him, the two of them in the comfortable quiet of brothers who have run out of words for the moment and found that silence works just as well. She thought about September, about Hogwarts and the train, and everything that the coming year would contain. All the things she read about in the Prophet, in careful sentences that didn't say what they meant. All the things that everyone around her was thinking about and not saying, at dinner tables and in sitting rooms and in alleys that had gone quieter than they should be. And she thought about a small silver package and 60 seconds of somewhere entirely good, and a box of color-coded sweets that someone had spent years making properly, and a sign that had lit up Diagon Alley on a summer evening and pulled people out of their careful quiet and into the lamplight. The alley needed it, perhaps more than it knew. She stood in the warmth of the sign's glow and let herself feel that, fully, without qualification, without reaching for her notebook. It was enough, more than enough. It was, quietly and exactly, what this particular evening had been for. The crowd left the way good evenings leave, unhurriedly, in pieces, each departure feeling less like an ending and more like a natural pause. The Carmichaels went first. Beatrice had Marcus's arm properly now, not the careful through-the-elbow hold of earlier, but something easier. Her hand in the crook of his elbow and her shoulder against his. The way people walk when they've stopped thinking about how they're walking. They said goodnight to Fred and George with the warmth of people who have received something they hadn't expected to need. And Marcus shook both twins' hands in the manner of a man making a note of people worth knowing. Then they walked back down the alley together, unhurried, toward whatever the evening still held for them. Callum left next, with the reluctance of someone who has just discovered something excellent and is already calculating when he can return. He shook Fred's hand with great seriousness. Fred received this with equal seriousness, which was, Ron thought, exactly the right response. Callum looked at the sign one more time before he turned the corner. The way you look at something you want to keep. And then he was gone. Lavinia Beach said goodnight to George with what appeared to be the exchange of some kind of professional contact, a card or the wizarding equivalent. Ron wasn't close enough to see. Florian Fortescue collected his empty cups and tray with the efficient tidiness of a man who has been in business long enough that clearing up has become second nature. He stopped on his way back across the alley and looked at the sign one final time. "Good sign," he said, to no one in particular, and went inside. Mrs. Puddifoot was last. She stood from her crate with the measured care of someone whose knees have opinions about improvised seating. She straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and looked at the shop. At all of it. The sign, and the windows, and the half-built interior visible through the glass, with an expression that was simply, openly fond. "You'll do well," she said, to Fred and George, not as encouragement, as information, the tone of someone reporting something they consider settled. "Thank you, Mrs. Puddifoot," George said. "The other Mrs. Puddifoot," she said, and walked away with the unhurried dignity of someone entirely satisfied with how she had spent her evening. And then it was just the four of them, Fred and George and Ron and Hermione, standing on the pavement outside the shop in the quiet that followed, which was a different quiet from the one that had existed before the sign lit, fuller somehow, the way a room feels different after people have been in it, warmer, more itself, settled into its own purpose. Nobody said anything for a moment. The alley around them had returned to its evening stillness. The lanterns burned steadily. The cobblestones held their warmth. Somewhere at the far end, a door closed softly, and the sound carried in the way sounds carry in empty streets, clear and complete. George looked at the sign. 4 inches, he said. 6, said Fred. We measured. Edwina Crabbe measured. There's a difference. Edwina Crabbe has been looking at that wall for 31 years. At a slight angle. Hermione made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but somewhere between the two. The sound of someone who has given up on a particular argument and found the surrender unexpectedly pleasant. Ron smiled at the cobblestones. They went inside to tidy. It didn't take long. The boxes were mostly where they'd started. The counter was clear. The prototype that had escaped earlier had been located under a shelf and returned to its crate with a slightly more secure seal. Fred swept, George restacked, Hermione straightened the labeling on 3 boxes that had been handled enough to go crooked, because she couldn't not, because that was simply who she was. And the shop was the better for it. Ron held a box while George repacked it, passing items across in the easy rhythm of people who have done things together enough that the coordination is automatic. And at some point, Fred started humming something tuneless, and George joined in, a different key entirely. And the shop filled briefly with something that was almost music, and more importantly, was simply theirs. Hermione looked at all of it, said nothing, and remembered it. They came out together. Fred locked the door, and they stood on the pavement and looked up. The sign had found its final register for the evening. Not the blazing announcement of earlier, not the warm, active glow of the demonstration hours, but something quieter than both, a steady, even light, deep gold against the dark wood, the letters clear and unhurried. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Just the name, nothing more. As though the sign had decided, after everything it had said, that the name was sufficient, that the name, said plainly in good light to an empty alley, was exactly enough. Fred looked at it for a long moment. "There it is," he said. It was a small thing to say. It contained quite a lot. George stood beside him, Ron beside George, Hermione at the end, and the four of them were quiet together, in the way that people are quiet when something real has just become real. When the thing that existed in theory and planning and late nights and argued measurements has stepped forward into the world and said, "Here I am." The sign glowed. The alley was still. Somewhere above them, in the flat over the maintenance supplies shop, a light went on. Lavinia Beach, home for the evening. In the apothecary, Mr. Brimstone's shadow moved across his frosted window, the outline of a man doing the last tasks of the day. And in the portrait, just visible through the darkened glass of the shop next door, Edwina Crabbe sat with her hands folded, watching the alley as she always did, as she had always done, as she would continue to do. She looked at the sign. She looked, Ron thought, quietly satisfied. They walked back together through the alley, toward the leaky cauldron and the flue and the ordinary world waiting on the other side of it. The cobblestones were warm underfoot. The lanterns went past one by one, each briefly overhead and then behind, the light moving across their faces in the rhythm of people walking at the same pace. Fred had his hands in his pockets. George was saying something to Hermione about the compound trials, when and how and what the methodology should be, and Hermione was listening with the attention she gave to things that mattered, which was the same attention she gave to everything, only more so. Ron walked beside them, said nothing in particular, and looked at the alley around him, at the old stones and the old light and the old quiet, and thought about Mr. Brimstone's unexpected smile, and Mrs. Puttyfoot on her crate, and Beatrice Carmichael's face in those 60 seconds, and Callum memorizing the address on his way out. He thought about the sign, still glowing behind them in the empty alley, still there, still warm, still saying the name. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. He thought about what Fred had said, quietly, in the half-built shop, with the evidence of it all visible through the window. People are hungry for it. And about the particular summer they were all inside of, with its careful quiet and its held breath and its profit headlines that didn't say what they meant. And he thought, yes, perhaps they are. Perhaps that is exactly what this is for. He didn't say any of this. There was no particular reason to say it. He walked with his brothers and his friend through Diagon Alley, in the lantern light, at the end of an evening that had been, by any reasonable measure, exactly what it needed to be. Behind them, the sign burned steadily on.